Hello everyone, welcome back to Review and Rate. Today, we're entering into a world of space pilots and mutated creatures. That's right, we're going to grab our stick and keep smacking enemies to talk about the Callisto Protocol, a game developed by Striking Distance Studios and released in 2022. If you're a fan of bad combats, repetitive enemy encounters, and awful stories, you won't want to miss this review. Now, let's keep dodging these attacks and get ready to enter the world of the Callisto Protocol. The Callisto Protocol delivers mostly bad gameplay with a few good ideas and a lot of wasted potential that could have been a much better game. First, I want to mention that I probably wouldn't have played this game if I hadn't gotten it for free. When I did get it, I was actually excited to try it. I had already seen many people criticizing the game, but I still wanted to experience it myself and see if it was really as bad as people said, especially because the game looks so good. Unfortunately, after playing it, I ended up being disappointed. During the first or 3 chapters, I was actually having fun. The game seemed promising at the beginning, and I thought it might turn out to be a solid experience. But after a while, I started to realize what the game was really about, and that's when the problems began to show. Let's start with the good things, even though some of them still have issues. There are a few different weapons that you can buy and upgrade using points you collect as you progress through the game. There's also a telekinesis ability that lets you grab enemies and throw them into environmental traps, which can be pretty fun when it works. The game also includes several enemy types, but unfortunately they don't feel very unique. Many of them behave in similar ways and attack using the same patterns, which quickly makes combat repetitive and less exciting. You can heal yourself using medkits you find during exploration, and there's a health indicator on the back of your character's head. However, healing is extremely slow, which means you usually can't heal safely while enemies are attacking you. Stealth is also an option, allowing you to quietly eliminate enemies. However, there are frustrating sections where the game forces you into stealth against robots that cannot be attacked at all. If they spot you, they instantly kill you, which makes these sections more annoying than tense. There are also collectibles, such as audio logs that tell the stories of certain characters in the game. Unfortunately, most of them contain fairly boring dialogue and aren't very interesting to listen to. The inventory system allows you to carry weapons and items, which is good in theory. The problem is that it's extremely limited, so you quickly run out of space once you start collecting ammo, health items, and other supplies. The game saves automatically, and you can also save manually. However, manual saving feels almost pointless because when you die, the game often sends you back to frustrating checkpoints that are placed far away from where you failed. Another core mechanic is a dodge system. It allows you to avoid enemy attacks, but because enemies tend to attack in very predictable ways, combat becomes repetitive. While the mechanic itself works, the way enemies attack can look awkward and sometimes even ridiculous. Those are mostly the positive aspects of the gameplay. Unfortunately, the problems are much bigger. The level design is one of the biggest issues. The game constantly forces you through tight spaces and narrow corridors, which quickly becomes repetitive and uninteresting, especially when enemies appear over and over again. Another frustrating decision is that if you want to experience the full story, you need to buy the Final Transmission DLC. Locking that true ending behind paid DLC feels unnecessary and disappointing. Looting enemies is also handled in a strange way. Every time you want to collect loot from enemies, you have to stomp on their bodies. After killing multiple enemies in a fight, it becomes confusing and tedious to remember that you still have to stomp each one just to collect your rewards. There's also no map in the game. Many times I found myself wandering around trying to figure out where to go because there's no clear navigation system. Only a basic objective that appears on the screen. This makes exploration feel confusing rather than immersive. And this leads to another big question. What kind of game is this supposed to be? Is it survival horror or something else? At times it feels like the game itself doesn't know what it wants to be. The game clearly tries to be scary, but in my experience, it really isn't. Even the jump scares feel weak and predictable. Because of that, the horror never really lands. For a game that presents itself as survival horror, it's strange how little actual fear it creates. But the biggest problem with the Callisto Protocol is the combat. At first, I was actually enjoying it. Early on, the fights felt tense and engaging. However, as you progress through the chapters and face enemy after enemy, the combat quickly becomes repetitive and boring. The encounters follow the same exact structure over and over again. You move to a new area, enemies appear, you fight them, then you move to another area and fight another group of enemies. This cycle repeats constantly, and after a while it becomes extremely predictable and uninteresting. Eventually it became so frustrating that I tried to simply run past enemies to move on, but the game often prevents that, forcing you to kill everything before you can continue. This only makes the frustration worse. Things get even more annoying when multiple enemies attack you at the same time. The combat system clearly isn't designed well for handling groups, and this leads to many unfair situations where you keep dying again and again. And remember, I was playing on the easiest difficulty. Because of this, many chapters end up taking far longer than they should, not because they are challenging in a fun way, but because you keep dying and repeating the same encounters. It eventually got to the point where I just forced myself to finish the game so I could be done with it. Honestly, because of how repetitive and frustrating the combat becomes, this is easily one of the worst gameplay experiences I have had in a long time. Let's now talk about the story. The story of the Callisto Protocol is honestly pretty terrible. The dialogue, the characters, and even the villains are all extremely boring and uninteresting. I never felt connected to any of them, and because of that, I found it very hard to care about what was happening in the story. That being said, the overall premise is fairly simple and does have a few interesting ideas. You play as Jacob, a cargo pilot who transports supplies through space. During one of his deliveries, his ship is suddenly attacked by a group known as the Outer Way. The attack causes the ship to crash on Callisto, the moon where the Black Iron prison is located. After the crash, Jacob is arrested by the prison guards and thrown into a Black Iron prison. Not long after that, a mysterious outbreak spreads throughout the facility, mutating prisoners and guards into monstrous creatures known as biophages. As chaos spreads through the prison, Jacob manages to escape his cell and begins fighting his way through the facility while trying to survive the outbreak. Along the way, he encounters a few other survivors as he struggles to make it out alive. Unfortunately, while the setup sounds interesting, the execution never really delivers. The characters remain dull, the dialogue lacks impact, and the story fails to create any emotional investment. Now let's talk about the graphics. One area where the Callisto Protocol truly stands out is its graphics. The environments, character models, and enemy designs all look fantastic. The level of detail throughout the prison and surrounding areas is very impressive, and visually the game does a great job creating a dark and atmospheric setting. However, there is one small issue that stood out to me: the fire effects. Compared to the rest of the visuals, the fire looks surprisingly bad and out of place. It doesn't match the same level of quality as the rest of the game's graphics. Aside from that small problem, the game is visually excellent. Now let's talk about the sound. The sound design in the Callisto Protocol is decent, but nothing particularly impressive or memorable. The audio does its job. The environmental sounds help create atmosphere. The enemies sound appropriately disturbing, and the voice acting for the characters is generally fine. From a technical standpoint, everything works as expected. However, the soundtrack is where the game feels weaker. The music never really stands out, and there aren't any tracks that left a strong impression on me. By the time I finished the game, there was nothing from the soundtrack that made me want to go back and listen to it again. So while the sound design is perfectly serviceable, it ultimately feels average rather than memorable. Let's now move on to the final section, which is the replayability. When it comes to replayability, I honestly have zero interest in ever replaying the Callisto Protocol. There are DLC expansions available, but since they are paid content and the base game already disappointed me, I have no interest in buying or trying them. Technically, you can replay the game on higher difficulty levels for an extra challenge. However, the gameplay was already frustrating even on the lowest difficulty, so the idea of making the experience even harder doesn't appeal to me at all. Because of that, there is really nothing here that motivates me to return to the game. Let's now summarize everything with my overall impression. The Callisto Protocol delivers bad gameplay, a terrible story, amazing graphics, decent sound design, and very uninteresting replayability options. This is a game that had a lot of potential. In fact, during the first few chapters I was genuinely enjoying it and thought it might turn into a solid survival horror experience. Unfortunately, as the game goes on, the repetitive and frustrating combat begins to take over, and the overall gameplay quickly becomes exhausting rather than fun. Because of that, the experience slowly falls apart the longer you play. What started as something promising ultimately turns into a very disappointing game. It's a shame, because with better combat design and stronger gameplay variety, this could have been a much better title. But in its current state, the problems are simply too big to ignore. So sadly, this is the score it gets. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more insightful review videos. Feel free to share your thoughts on whether the points I've raised resonate with you or if you have a different perspective, and leave your suggestions in the comments about which game you'd like to see reviewed next. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you all for watching.